Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Manly Convos. I'm Corey Cummins, the founder. I'm really excited to have another episode today. And just to kind of give you a background on what Manly Convos is and why I started this program, the goal is to destigmatize men's mental health. And the way we're doing this is three ways. We're having conversations with men who have gone to therapy. We're having conversations with mental health professionals about specific topics associated to men. And we're also talking to nonprofits and men's mental health groups to kind of give you a full perspective on everything in the men's mental health space to kind of help you get through whatever you need to get through. Today I have Brendan Kwiatkowski, right? Sweet, got the name right. Awesome. And I'm really excited to have him on today. Brandon has an amazing background, an amazing CV. And one of the topics that he wanted to discuss today was one of the biggest things men struggle with is loneliness. So, Brandon, before we jump into it, can you just give a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm from the Vancouver area in Canada, and I was a high school teacher. Did my special education master's degree in special education, focused on students with emotional behavioral disorders, quote unquote. And turns out around 81% of those are boys. And so started researching why is that? How much is biology? How much is socialization? What are all these factors? Did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh researching the emotion, basically the relationship that young men have with emotions and comparing the least emotionally expressive with the most emotionally expressive uh, late teenage year boys. And I create programs, lead programs for another term in quotes that I don't love so much, at-risk youth, troubled boys. Basically the boys that have a lot of run-ins with schools for various reasons or one another. But I'm just passionate about being a part of healing, whether that's in my personal life. I take it very I take a high level of care in I view it as like so integrous that I am always looking inward in anything that I do outward.
Sure.
Definitely don't want to be a hypocrite in any of these areas.
No, that's fair. Well, no, I really appreciate that. So, obviously, I asked you for what topic you want to discuss today, and I really wanted to talk about loneliness in men 'cause it's something that I see with a lot of different people I know, and especially during COVID. But so, why are men more prone to loneliness?
Yeah, if I can actually just go back for a moment, I think that like why is loneliness such a big topic? And I would say that
Sure.
there's two or three kind of reasons why I think loneliness, if I had to say one issue for men at all, it would be loneliness because the things that we do to try and prevent loneliness can be really harmful in terms of like fitting in. Um, like so many of the teenage boys, like their biggest fear is being ostracized by their friends or feeling like no one wants to be the kid that no one else likes. That's a direct quote from my research. And so the things that people do to not feel alone can be very problematic. But then for boys themselves and men themselves, that feeling alone in this world when we're very social creatures and human connection is such a valuable thing about human flourishing is like that can lead to hopelessness, which is one of the biggest predictors of suicide. And we know that men have a very high, disproportionately high suicide rate in comparison to women. Suicide rates for men are often at the highest near the end of their working careers, like retirement age, is when the suicide rates become the most disproportionate. And so you can look at all these different factors. I think loneliness also ties in with purpose and meaning. What purpose do we have in life? What meaning do we have in life? If we're alone, what's the point of it? There's all of those issues. And there's one more, but I'm not recalling it right now, so maybe we'll bounce back to it. But I think loneliness sums up so much human behavior and it has so many negative impacts on how we might hurt other people in our attempts to not feel lonely, but also how we hurt ourselves because loneliness is such a distressing emotion to feel or a distressing emotional experience.
Got it. And so, why you were saying that basically the things that we do to fit in and not be ostracized can also cause loneliness. So what do you mean by that exactly? Like, what are some of the things that people do that has the reverse effect?
Yeah, so when I compared these grade 12 boys, the most emotionally expressive and the most emotionally restricted teenage boys, the thing it was that they were actually quite similar across most areas. People ask me, like, during my PhD, like, why are you testing the extremes? Like, you might find boys that are so far different from each other. And the thing is, they weren't. They were very actually close. But the one issue where they were the most far apart was their feelings of aloneness. That the teenage boys that were more emotionally restricted, meaning they didn't feel as comfortable sharing with people in their lives, with trusted people about what's going on in their lives, their feelings, felt more alone. And there's a huge distinction is that most of these boys, almost all of them, were actually still quite popular at school. They had friends. And so it wasn't even talking about the amount of friendships they had. It was that they felt alone in their emotional experience. They felt like they were the only teenage boys that were going through what they were going through. And then they had to navigate life alone, not at all talking about whether they had social friendships. Is that there wasn't a depth to those social friendships, that they still felt alone. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Brene Brown, but she found in her research, she researches shame and vulnerability, that the opposite of belonging was fitting in. And that was kind of surprising because, like, and I would say that kind of encompasses what a lot of these teenage boys have the pressure to fit in, not be seen as weak, be one of the boys, is that if they felt like that wasn't authentically them and they had to put on this mask or portray this performance, they fit in, but they still felt so alone because they weren't seen for who they really were. And I think all humans have a desire to be seen and understood. And I think that speaks to a lot of men's loneliness because there's a lot of projection in masculine circles. And I don't want to demonize all of it whatsoever, but I do know that every single boy that I talked to in my PhD research wanted at least a bit more emotional depth with some of their male friends. And none of them thought that their other male friends wanted the same thing. So they're all just have a desire for more, but don't know how to do that. And they expect that no one else has that same desire.
What was the age that you were doing the research on?
17 to 19.
It's funny you say that because I'm 38, but in the UK, actually in general, more of my friends are close friends are women than men. And I started going to therapy when I was 25 because I lost my mother. But part of the reason I had two friends, take their lives over the years of my kind of, all
I'm
through
so
the
sorry.
years. And
Yeah.
the recent one, I realized I was like, why do I gravitate more towards my female friends? And I realized was that because there were certain conversations I felt that I couldn't, not that I couldn't have, I would have it with my male friends, but the conversation just wouldn't be as in depth. It wouldn't be as long. It didn't feel like I could be as open per se, or it had to be over drinks and things like that, which I don't really drink anymore. And so it always felt like there was something attached to it. And so I can understand why, especially boys, I couldn't imagine. And obviously times have changed. When I was 17 years old, there was no chance my friends and I were talking about anything emotional
Mm.
except for sports and school and girls or whatever it was. So it's interesting to hear that. How long ago did you do this research?
21 was when I did the interviews.
Okay, so
But
not
it
even that long ago.
No, it was like right, yeah, during COVID. And yeah, like the research is a long process. Like it wasn't finished till 2023.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but what you just said was a sub theme of my research, which I called women as emotional safe havens, because not all boys, but their draw to who was emotionally safe for them tended to be women on average. And the reasons they gave, which maybe you can resonate or not, is that they felt like women were better listeners, that there was less judgment um, coming from them if they would share the things. And I think what one boy so poignantly said, or maybe it's scarily that he said it, but he's like, oh, if I want to have a good time, I'll hang out with my male friends. If I want to be real, then I'll hang out with my female friends, which I do think speaks to a lot of people's experience. But then when you look on the internet about a lot of older men, or young men still as well, I would say one of the comments I see the most is how many men are now angry at women for betraying their trust when they have been emotionally vulnerable with them. Like that is a very common thing of like, oh, you can't tell a woman anything because they'll use it against you. Like Shaquille O'Neal was on a podcast a couple months ago saying that like you can never trust to share with a woman. And I see this tension that in my research and other research is that women often are the trusted ones. And part of me postulates or has a theory that that if you put all of your trust eggs in one basket, then like yeah, humans can be nasty and we can like vulnerability requires us to be vulnerable because someone else can use that against us. But if we kind of only give our eggs to like one person and then that gets destroyed, it's like yeah, we that does happen and that sucks that happens. But I also think that sometimes men aren't, how do I say this, that men like part of being vulnerability takes so much courage is to actually like venture out with your friends and see if they want a deeper emotional connection as well, and you have to test out emotional vulnerability. But a lot of the ways that the boys in my research did that with their male friends was to present their emotional vulnerability as a joke so they could hide behind it in case it didn't land well. So if I'm talking to my male friends and be like sad about a breakup that happened, I kind of make a joke about it of like what a bitch she is or something like that to kind of warm it up, and then it might just kind of devolve into like maybe anger would be the most comfortable vulnerable-ish emotion to express. But if it's like someone actually said like I'm actually really sad about that, that would be feel too vulnerable. So it's easier to hide behind a joke. But then the negative feedback loop of that is that sometimes the other boys think then that is a joke, that their friend is just joking and it isn't serious. But I asked all these boys, like, hey, if your male friend actually like was sad and like wanted to express, like, would you want them to tell you that? And they all said they would want to show up for their male friend. But I think sometimes when men present things as a joke or not as serious, uh, it's harder for the other guys to pick up that, oh, he's actually really serious and I should respond to him in a more caring, sensitive way.
So with all these kind of like facts and things, not facts, but tidbits that we're talking about, if you were to bring this together, why do you think that men are actually more prone to loneliness? Like, is there any common factors? Is it just because we're afraid to talk about it, or because we're afraid to get shamed, or like, is there any kind of overarching theme on why that happens?
There's a lot of different ways. So the three main reasons why emotional loneliness occurs from my research was fear of judgment, which was tied with fear of being a burden. And both of those two reasons, the boys themselves felt like that was tied in with masculine expectations. That they like the burden ones being like, as a man, I want to be the shoulder for other people to cry on. I don't want to. Like, so it's motivated out of the deep sense of care for others that we don't want to open up as much because we want to support the people in our lives and not be a burden to them. So I think we should have very compassionate understanding of the motivations because I think sometimes in common discourses it gets like, oh, they're just too afraid. Men are too afraid to show up. It's weakness. It's like, um, yeah, that is part of their fear that it might be a weakness and that they might be judged by it. And sometimes that's validated by actually being judged by it. A lot of them did have experiences of that. And the third reason had nothing to do with masculinity, and I always want to mention it, is that like we also exist as individuals, not part of social gender norms and expectations. And the third one is like based on trauma, that they had been emotionally close to someone in the past, but that relationship had ended tragically, whether through death or divorce or something had happened where they're like, I don't want to get emotionally close with someone again because that was painful the last time I did it, and I don't want to experience that pain again. And so all of those factors are one main reason why men have sometimes less experience or less willingness to enter into emotionally close relationships. And that is one of the best antidotes to loneliness. Because if you look at the boys who were the most emotionally expressive, like the main reasons why they loved having emotional safe havens was that they felt more connected to other people. They felt like it gave perspective about their lives. And it was just like they felt like they were just living more fully, because emotions are a human experience, not limited to any gender. Like emotions are not gendered, although we have gendered beliefs about emotions, but how we experience emotions um, isn't. And so that's one aspect of the loneliness. But I would also say for guys, why we're more prone to loneliness, other than those reasons, and sometimes seeing it as weakness if we're emotionally connected, would just be that the way that men are often seen as valuable is for our productive role in society, which leads men to be more like workaholic type things, that we're doing it for the hustle, for the grind. And so I think this is a reason why the suicide rate with loneliness and why men do worse after divorces than women do on average is because women are generally better at social connections and having a sense of community, whereas sometimes in marriages, generally speaking, trends is that like wives are the social glue of like I've been guilty of this too, in that like sometimes like my my friend's wife and my wife, they used to like plan more of the things to see each other, and like we wouldn't actually end up ever planning the things to see each other, but we're always happy to see each other. And so like the social meeting expectation often falls on the woman, and that's also part of why men have to like actually be intentional about hanging out. But it's easy, and it's been embedded for a long time about like the workaholism aspect of where do we find value? We find value when we can produce, um, and maybe having to expand our notion of where we find value of these like relationships, because I know that most men like have extremely and desire extremely vulnerable and valuable connections with other men, but they might not feel, or they might not actually practically have much time to invest in those relationships. They're tired when they get home from work, and so they might numb out watching TV for the evening or things like that.
No, those things all really resonate. I wrote a couple of them down. I think I actually remember when I was younger, I had a couple of friends whose parents who battled cancer, and I was always the
Mm.
one they went to help for. And then when my
Mm.
mom started battling cancer for 3 years, I didn't open up to anybody except for my girlfriend at the time. I was also
Mm.
a lot younger, didn't go to therapy. And I remember I was like, well, nobody understands what I'm going through, so I can't talk to anybody about it, which is obviously, looking back on it, you're like, that's ridiculous.
Mm.
And then I remember obviously going to therapy. I realized I got the tools to be able to feel comfortable communicating with my friends and being open and honest. But I think the thing about also men wanting to take care, but also opening up, the one thing I've seen, at least here, is that I think where I was struggling with friends here is that they will open up, but they need to be about 7 or 8 pints deep to open up.
Mm. Yeah.
And I stopped drinking this year. But even before that, because I went to therapy for so long, that I was like, well, actually, if something really stressful happens, like my friend who decided to take his life, I go, okay, I'm not going to touch any substances for the next 4 to 6 weeks. This is before I stopped drinking, to make sure that I'm not using that to cope with what's going on. And so I think that's where I was getting frustrated. I was like, I don't want to have to sit here and drink to talk to you about this stuff. I want to be able to have an honest conversation. And it's actually, when I looked at it, because I've had this conversation with other people on the podcast, but on a different topic, is that what I always think was, when you look at like societal pressures, like as a woman, like women, it's okay to be open and emotional and cry and do all these things and talk, whereas a man, like, you're not supposed to do those things. You're not supposed to cry. You're not supposed to open up. So there's so much societal pressure as well. Not even societal pressure, but like, what is this, like societal norms of like how you're supposed to act and things like that, where it just makes it even harder to kind of break out of that shell. Especially in countries like the UK, where stiff upper lip type thing. You don't show your emotion. So it's really unfortunate that kind of happens. And actually, I'm going to do like a little sidetrack. I saw one of your Instagram posts the other day about the male vaccinations, which I really appreciated. Do you think, and then I'm going to come back to it, but I'm kind of tied back in. Do you think there's any way with that, and you'll have to explain to people what it is, because I would really like what you're talking about. Do you think there's any way you could use that in context to to loneliness?
Absolutely. Um, so the concept of male vaccination, before your back goes up even more, is based off of a concept that Dr. Becky Kennedy, who's a parenting expert, really love her stuff if you are a parent. She termed something called emotional vaccination, which is just particularly for highly anxious children. It's a valuable metaphor of like, hey, if you know something is going to be something could lead to tantrums or a lot of emotional dysregulation, you give them a little bit of preparedness ahead of time so that when they go through the transition, it's not so bad. So that could be even as small as like getting rid of screen time of like, okay, you know, you should have meltdown every time you turn off screen time, giving them like advanced noticing, like, okay, you might feel frustrated when this happens. That's normal. Just basically, so I'm using that concept, extending it that, oh yeah, this is the third thing that why loneliness matters so much is because I think one of the huge topics around boys, men, and masculinity is the lack of male guidance and intergenerational guidance. I would say that the huge thing. So there's a loneliness intergenerationally, and this comes back to the masculinity vaccinations, which is just preparing boys and men in advance of the next stage of boyhood or manhood. And so I could see this in two places right away. One is that the transition from middle school to high school is one of the most uh, developmentally intense for boys growing up, because that's when pressures are heightened to fit in. That's when boys express feeling the least authentic with themselves. You got puberty. You're dealing with a lot of stuff at that time. So, and that's also the stage of life where parents tend to be like backing off from teenage boys, especially because it's kind of like, oh, parents tend to assume that teenage boys are easier than teenage girls, partly because they think that teenage boys are less emotional. And part of that is because boys are hiding it and suppressing it, and they don't want their parents to worry about them. So it all makes this beautiful mess. And the thing that boys need is actually more attuned guidance to prepare for this life stage of what is like. One of the boys that I interviewed in grade 12 had just been released from hospital after a suicide attempt. And he said that this traced back all back to when he started puberty, is that he started becoming depressed in grade 8 and 9, and he didn't know what that was. He thought maybe it's just puberty, and so never sought out help about it. And I think that's a perfect example of like why we need to tell boys in advance, not to fear monger, but to be like, you might feel more alone than you've ever felt, that you're the only boy that's going through this, and that is demonstrably false. So that's an example of how to use this masculine vaccination concept then. But I also think that men on near the ends of their career should be getting this as well, of like preparing them for the next stage of like, what is your value? What are you going to invest in if it's not work? If you've put so much meaning behind this, like there's other things, and that should be a conversation I think that happens, like, because a lot of businesses, they give you like preparation of like pension plans and things like that financially, but I think it has to be more emotionally, and I think adult men need to be targeted there as well. And I will just also say, in case you have audience members too, because I always, it is such a controversial subject, and I always want to say that like in the UK, there was this huge study about suicide rates of these older men, and like 90% of them had reached out for help um, before dying from suicide. And so that's also important to remember. Like, not it's not that these men aren't trying. At least the older age of men are. They are trying, according to the research as well.
I'm trying to remember, write down exactly. So there's the reason why I was smiling is because One, I really appreciate the male vaccination thing because I think it's such a brilliant, and I'm sure if people just heard it without hearing your description, they'd be like, "Why the hell is this?"
Totally.
But I think it's great because I remember actually when I saw it, I was like, "No, vaccination, what is this?" And then I listened to it, and I think when what you were just saying about for young men, and this is for anybody, not just men, but women as well, young
Absolutely.
girls, like man, and I think about all the times in life where I wish someone could have been like, and even it's funny in different parts of my career, like when I went from being an individual contributor in a business to a senior manager to having my own business to all these things, you're like, yeah, there's all these different emotional things that you go through that would have been great if someone could have kind of talked you through it. But I think the reason I was smiling is my father, incredibly successful man, built a very successful business, sold it, still works for the company that bought it, and he's 74, and he could have retired a long time ago. And it's interesting, kind of going on a tangent here, but one of my good friends is a psychiatrist, and we talked about during COVID about how the reason why people are struggling is because of their identity loss, and that could be everything
Mm.
from me being the planner of all my friends and not being able to plan anymore, like whatever. And so I was talking to her about this, and she was like, "Yeah, your dad probably my dad's an eye doctor, so
Mm.
he very much identifies as an eye doctor. That's all he's ever done. That's all he
Mm.
knows." And I've always been with him, talked to my dad. I'm like, "Why don't you retire, man?" I was like, "You work so hard, like go do some shit, have some fun." And he's like, "Yeah, but what else would I do if I work? If I stopped working?" I go,
Mm.
I'm like, "There's a lot of stuff you could do, Dad." And I was like, "I could give you a monster list." And especially with the means that you have, there's a lot of opportunity for you to do whatever you
Mhm.
want. But yeah, you can see, and my stepmom's the same. She's 74, incredibly successful woman, worked her whole career. She does very well, and both of them you can see are struggling to pull the trigger on retirement. And I understand one side, they see a lot of their friends who retire, they can see how quickly they decline mentally, and
Mm.
like they're nowhere near as sharp as they are. Like they are so sharp. And I said to both of them, I go, "There's ways to stay sharp without working every day." I go, like my grandpa did it. He went to a community college. He took a course every quarter till he died, until he was 96. And when he died, he was still so sharp. He just body obviously, moved on.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that really resonated with me because I think this is something that I think would help people, a lot of people in many different aspects of life. But I think the other kind of thing here is I just actually did a podcast with Men Against Mountains. I don't know if you've ever
Mhm.
heard of them. It's a nonprofit group in the UK, and well, actually, it's more of a men's group where it's an online chat, but it focuses around men who might potentially want to take their lives.
Mm.
And she was talking about how they don't talk about men that are over 45 have a higher suicide rate than men under 45. And she was saying that a big reason for that is that actually men who are younger that commit suicide, she goes, obviously this is general stats, is that usually it's a mental health reason. She goes, but with men that are older, she goes, a lot of times it's functional life reasons. So
Mm.
it was kind of what you were saying. It could be lost their job, divorced, all these types of things, and ending their careers. So it's interesting to hear how you said it, in a different lens than the way she put it. But it's kind of, they both connect in what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think what she said and highlights, there's got to be wisdom in how to do the vaccinations or preparedness without creating more fear or um, almost being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like you don't want to tell boys that like, oh, this is going to be the worst time of your life, that like you feel alone and all these other things. It's like the line between preparing them for the realities of the world, but not assuming that the worst case scenario is the bar that's gonna you're gonna hit. But I loved what you were saying about your dad. It reminded me of two things. I've had three panic attacks in my life, and I would trace all of them back to, if I could like say anything to myself, not to shame myself, but like why did those happen? I can now identify like, oh, I had a really hard time with sitting with myself for prolonged periods of time. And almost all three of those came when my first one ever came after my ACL meniscus knee surgery. And I was just bedridden for a couple days. And I had never spent that so much stillness and time getting to know myself. And that was freaking like so scary. And I think this speaks to that workaholism. And I took a paternity leave with my first daughter. And basically, that first paternity leave was a very important lesson of how I don't like not doing anything. And I like had to be kept busy all of the time. And now it's like, oh, how do I actually be with myself? And I think that's super hard. Um, when like you think about retirement, like what is it? What is valuable? Like, and it was a hard time in my therapy to be like, I'm only valuable if I'm it's not valuable for me to heal for myself. It's only valuable if I can learn some healing so I can help someone else heal. And that was my bent for so long. And I think I've unlearned that enough to be like, oh, my own healing matters. I love it when I can help other people heal, but like it's so interconnected that it can't be one or the other. Because if I am just doing it so I can help other people, then I'm not actually integrating the healing and the learning for myself. And yeah, that's the dynamic that I was reminded of as you were sharing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm very lucky. Like my father was a great dad, great husband. Now, obviously, he grew up in a different generation than me. He also had a very different upbringing than me, dealing with, his dad had, was manic and things like that,
Mm.
and was a great guy, but just, and also manic in, the '60s is very different than now. And so, yeah, he just had a very different experience in life than I did. So, obviously, as you were talking about generational understanding and being able to process and look at things very differently, it's interesting kind of how I've learned how to like better understand him. And I've had to like, sometimes my brother is great. My brother and I are very different emotionally. Like my brother and I both go to therapy. We're both very open and honest with each other, which is a beautiful thing. I feel very lucky to have that. But my brother and my dad, they get along like no other. My dad loves to support, but my dad doesn't understand how like to sit down and have a really emotional conversation. He doesn't have the tools. And it's not because he's a bad person, but to him he's like, let's be happy, like let's just move forward. And saying that to my brother, that's like the worst thing you could ever say.
Mm.
To me, I'm like, I understand where he's coming from. He's not saying it as like, fuck your emotions, they're shit, you shouldn't talk about it. It's just he doesn't know how to do it. But it's funny because I've had to almost like coach both of them without them knowing, on
Mm.
both sides, being like, hey dad, don't say this to Craig because
Mm.
he's gonna want to kill you. I was like, just say this or don't say anything. Just show up for him and listen to him and just be quiet. And then I've had to talk to my brother, being like, hey, this is when dad says these things. He doesn't mean that like he thinks you shouldn't feel the way you feel and he thinks that you're stupid for the way you feel. I go, he looks at you as his son. He just wants you to not be sad and depressed.
Yeah.
And my brother wasn't even depressed, but just to be sad.
Hmm.
And so like having to kind of like do that, but I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't go to therapy. Because I like sat back and I go, okay, like why is this happening? And so and again, I'm very lucky. We all live each other. We all get along really well. We're all different, very different personalities and personas. And obviously, losing my mother, it was funny. My dad was like, "I didn't realize all the conversations you used to have with mom, but now you have with me."
Mm.
And
Wow.
so it
Yeah.
is funny how things evolve and stuff like that. But one of the things I guess to because there's obviously a lot of things you talk about why loneliness happens, but what are actually the impacts that it can have on boys?
I guess we talked about the main one, which would be isolation and hopelessness and potentially harm against oneself. But the other impacts, I would say, connect into like, okay, what's the epitome of loneliness in men culture and anywhere, sorry, would be with incels. Like they some like black pilled is a very nihilistic approach that like nothing, there's no way out, nothing matters. I'm completely alone, and they found this um, skewed community. I don't know what like I like two things are true. I have so much compassion for a very high risk suicide population of incels, but not compassion for the misogyny, the sexism, and violence that they talk about and sometimes enact upon others. Um, so both those things I'm holding there, and I hope that the listeners can as well. But um, I guess that showcases what kind of the turmoil of what loneliness can feel like, and what it can do is that you can put the blame onto other people. Um, we can experience a lot of shame for so many different things. Like, we're in a shame culture for so many different reasons. But one of the biggest ways to prevent feelings of shame is to uh, resort to anger, because anger is an externalizing emotion. So you can put out anger, point the finger somewhere else, so then we don't have to look inside. And I think a lot of us are lonely within inside ourselves, and we will look to someone else to rescue. So often, like, um, incels, in a way, both view women as their saviors, and they also view them as their rejectors and demonize them because they could be helping them, but they're not. And so they're looking for someone else and to save them from loneliness. And so that's one aspect here. And another um, impact too. I don't know, impact is the right word, but I think with this conversation around loneliness, what we don't talk about enough, I think, is that connection with pornography. I think pornography is such a loaded conversation that it's either like so anti, or it's like totally normalized. And I think that I would love to at least open up some curiosity around the subject about being um, like, how much is porn use trying to mitigate a sense of loneliness that you feel? How is it compensating for, like, oh, feeling valued, or it's a way for me not to feel this distressing feeling so I can escape reality for a long time? And so I would say that that is a kind of another impact as well. Also, the last one that I'll say is the impacts of loneliness, of trying to fit in, is that we become who we aren't. One of the boys, one of my least favorite or favorite quotes from one of my teenage boys in my PhD research said, I've started to forget about my super emotional self, but I think that's a good thing, because I'm more well liked, and I just present myself as this fun, loving, go lucky guy, and I've kind of convinced myself that I am. Which, in order to say that, is a betrayal of oneself. Like, I'm not saying that's not strategic or adaptive, but I'm saying that ultimately, like, in order for him to know that he's doing that, means that on some conscious level, he actually knows he's suppressing a part of himself to be a different way. And that one is one thing, but the research also shows that you can then, to try and compensate and fit in, like, you might misuse drugs more, you might be more prone to violence to fit in gangs, cultures, things like that. So I guess loneliness impacts are everywhere. And what's a big draw about gangs and things like that is that they are a form of community. And so I think we're desperate for community in a culture that is weirdly moving towards more social connections that are parasocial relationships through social media, but less deep connections of, like, knowing our neighbor, knowing the grocer. I think when I was living in the UK, in Edinburgh, I feel like I had that more because it's just walkable. But, like, North America is such a drivable, like, everything's built for cars, where we're more isolated, and yet we have more people interactions that we, or faces that we see, but less. Yeah, we're in need of community.
Yeah, I completely agree with all those things. I was just smiling because it's interesting. You see it like I see it as a. So I remember when I was younger, I felt like I was always quite lucky. I don't know why. I feel like my mom always gave me a lot, and my dad gave me a
Mm,
lot of sense of security, and so I don't know. I was always willing to kind of not follow the norms of everybody else, and I don't know where
mm,
that came from. I have no idea. But like my brother was older than me, incredibly brilliant guy, and him and his friends used to get picked on because they were the nerds, and also my brother didn't come out of the closet until he was later in life, and his friends were the same, and they used to get picked on all the time, and I used to go and kind of get in fights because of it,
mm,
because I was 6'2" when I was 14, and I just didn't care. I was like,
mm,
but I feel very lucky because for some reason I think just I naturally kind of had that mentality, but it's I see how it impacted some, like my brother and other people and things like that. It's just, yeah, it's really unfortunate kind of the way these things play out in society. But I see it as an adult, like in the working, in the workforce, like the fact that I don't drink really anymore, or when I used to drink, I'd get like a half pint at the bar, and I would get so much crap from adults, like, 40, 50-year-old people that have children being like, who drinks a half pint? And I'm like, what it matters to drink a quarter pint or an eighth of a pint? What does it matter? But it all stems back to these things about like everybody does it because they need to fit in and they have to go out and get drunk and they have to do all these things. And I'm like, why can't we go out for a nice dinner and have a chat and go home? and,
Yeah.
and
It's
I
the
know for a fact that I get shit for it, but I don't care.
it's the fact that the keeping up with the Joneses effect, that men assume other men are more sexist and misogynistic than men are. And by doing that, we think that we got to be this level and match the level around us, or we're less likely to speak out. But what you said about your personal experience is also a huge part of this conversation, is that our physical bodies also matter to how we embody ourselves. And so the boys that were most resistant, like it sounds like yourself, had a couple things in common, is that they hated the feeling of being inauthentic, and they had the confidence enough to risk social consequences, um, in favor of being more authentic. And one of the sub things that helped that was being, what mitigated the risks was being athletic, because they had some masculine currency and respect from their peers in some other way. Some that could be height, um, just more authority in some other area, which allowed them to be more emotionally authentic in other areas without being judged as harshly.
It is funny you say that. I did play sports when I was younger. So yeah, well, my brother played sports, but he was a swimmer. So it's a little bit,
Different sports have different currencies. I was mainly a
yeah,
volleyball
exactly.
player, and I was always told like, "Oh, that's the gayest of the sports," um,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
flick your
Which,
wrist after you hit the ball. Um, but
so what, oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say one more thing based on what you said. Um, let's see if I can go back to it because I think it was a good point.
Do you want me to say what I said again?
Maybe.
So what I said was that when I was younger, I felt very lucky because I didn't feel this. Even though I felt the pressure to fit in, I was still willing to like push against it and not kind of fit the bill because to me it just didn't work for me. I used to get in fights with my brother, not my brother, for my brother and his friends because he used to get picked on. And then in the workplace, I get made fun of all the time for not drinking or things like that.
Yes, and the workplace one is like part of it is that I, this is obviously very psychoanalytical, but your colleagues, your coworkers, it's like part of it is like, oh, if you're not one of us, what are you exposing, or are you judging us for drinking more, or all these other things? Because it was very similar when I took my first paternity leave. It was two of my older male coworkers who made fun of me for taking paternity leave, and when the second one did it, I challenged it. I was like, yeah, so what? And like, I let him just like, what's he actually going to say? And then he's like, oh no, actually, like, honestly, that's probably a pretty good thing. I wish when my children were younger, it had been more widely accepted because I think that would have been nice to actually spend more time with my young kids. And so it's like, what's the facade when you actually expose and challenge it underneath of like, why don't those buddies, your coworkers, want you to have less alcohol than them? Because I would like to think that if, like, let's say you're an alcoholic, I think men generally are very supportive of when they know someone has faced their demons and come through sobriety, of to not pressure that person. But they want everyone to like pressure them to go have drinks and have fun, and that is a chance for guys to connect often. So I think we want men often want other men to join in with them. But I do think that that is such a good example that you shared.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was about to say what you said, which is I think the reason why a lot of people need you to drink is, well, and I think a lot of people need it as a crutch socially. So they need the alcohol to just one loosen up, but then also like you see it in the office a lot of times. The way people have connected is by they get drunk and then it's 3 4 in the morning and they're having these random conversations and stuff and things like that. I think that's how they also use it to connect. Where for me, I go, well, actually, you're not really connecting. I go, you're pretty drunk and you're having a conversation. And also, maybe you shouldn't actually be having this conversation with this person in the office. It's
Mm.
like there's certain things that dynamics in office at play that, like, actually, should you be drunk at 4 a.m. with someone that's a level or two levels below you? Like, is that the right thing to do?
Mm.
And I know I sound quite boring, but those
Well,
are
that's, I
things, like,
think power dynamics is really important for that.
yeah. But those are things, you want to think about. Also, you creating the right culture. If people that are 2 levels below you see you as always going out and getting drunk with everybody, then actually, is that setting the right culture? It's like, oh, well, the leader is showing you that one of the most important things to creating connections is by getting drunk and staying out late. It's like, well, actually, there's also a lot of people. Like, I have people on my team who are different ages. Some younger than me, some a lot older than me, some have multiple kids, some live outside the city, whatever it is. And when when I do social engagements with my team, I try to make it so it's works for everybody. Because I'm like, okay, well, some people have kids. They don't want to get home at 9, 10 o'clock at night on a Wednesday. They want to get home and they want to see their partner and their children. And so these are things that I think sometimes people don't really take into account, but hopefully it is evolving. But I guess to go to the last part about this is, so what are the, I guess, helpful and unhelpful ways to deal with this?
Yeah, the unhelpful and helpful ways to deal with loneliness. Sorry, I'm pausing because there's just so much. Where do I want to tackle this question first? Let's start here. So, the unhelpful ways to deal with loneliness are things that create feedback loops that ends up feeling greater sense of loneliness. And I think, like, alcohol is one of those things which can bring. So I might argue slightly with what you said, is that I do think it brings some connection when you're having emotional vulnerability, or like weed, pot, for a lot of the teenage boys that I'm with. Like, when we have more vulnerable conversations, a lot of them feel like they need to get high after and things like that. Or they come high because they're anticipating something emotionally upsetting, and that feels like it calms them down. And so, like, my work with them is always to try and encourage them to do less and less. Like, kind of, all right, maybe you're connecting. Well, not for these teenage boys. I'm sure they are doing alcohol. I know they are. But, like, to just, can you take less of a substance in order to sit with the emotions with less? Because we know that, like, cannabis does actually often create more anxiety, even though it feels like it mitigates it. It can increase things like that. And alcoholism is one of the most, like, highest death rates of any substance that we have, and it's legalized. But it has so many health and mental health impacts as well. So I'd say that one of the worst or unhelpful ways to do it is to fight when you fight loneliness with things that contribute to more loneliness. And that goes back to even porn as well, is that um, often porn is done in isolation, and depending on the shame you experience, or maybe you don't experience shame after it at all, um, but that also could depend on your religious upbringing as well, is that the shame can also fuel the loneliness of never getting out, or never having, breaking your habits, or breaking the compulsion or addiction, whatever you call it. So that would be unhelpful. And then for other people, to help other people's loneliness, um, I'm not a big fan of shame-based approaches. Like, it's really good to know things not to do, but for positive identity formation, it's really important to have ways of being. And so a lot of that is through modeling. Like, so if we just tell the guys, you got to open up, you got to talk, or you can't suppress. Okay, that's important. I agree with that. But a lot of it is actually, like, modeling through the relationships that we have with each other, people who you're in close community with, of what that's like. So for parents, parents tend to use less emotional language when talking to their sons than to their daughters. And that's one of the ways that boys have less emotional practice. And so for your dad, doesn't necessarily, like, your dad has to cry in front of you, but has your dad ever reflected on his emotional experience, being like, hey, yeah, today was a really big work day. I was actually nervous before this presentation, to just show that they have some emotional working going on. That's one element of it. Because humans, but the boys in my research were most likely to pick up things based on what they saw and watched older men be, primarily their fathers, as opposed to what they heard being said. So that's a huge area. And is being positive focused, not shame based, modeling through example. Um, and I guess what's a really helpful way to deal with this is also just becoming emotionally safe for yourself. To be like, can you sit with your own self in silence? Do you always have to have music when you're driving in the car, and not making that a bad thing, but like, oh, maybe I should sit with my thoughts? I think journaling is a really good practice for, like, I hate journaling, yet I think it's so important. But I hate it because I hate how important it is, and I always minimize how important it is until after I do it, because I think I know everything that's going on inside me. I don't need to write it down. But what is beautiful about writing things down, it actually externalizes what's going on here, so you can make more sense of it. You can have a bit of space from it, and you can kind of see your thinking way more clearly, so that you can get some space from it. So there's a lot of things that people can do individually, um, but I also think that one of the helpful things, like if you have someone that is depressed or you don't even know, is that there is this level of, don't always ask them about like how are they doing and things like that. Just go invite them out to things. Like if you have a friend that hardly comes out, don't stop. Like you might be tempted to stop inviting your friend that's socially isolating all the time because he always says no. But just reaching out all the time, even if you're expecting the no, that is still can be a really powerful source of connection, of knowing they're not alone. And it's not like every conversation has to be a hard, deep conversation about depression or something like that. But just like invite, or like, hey, I'm coming over. I got an extra pizza here. Coming, dropping off at your door. Like there's a lot of proactive things we can do to help our fellow brothers out in this world. And just being proactive. Like when my best friend was killed in an accident when I was in Edinburgh, he I was quite depressed for like the next 3 months. So not clinically depressed, that's different, but I was very low, and I reached out to one of my friends who I was like, I feel like he's been in this place before, and he had been. It was so helpful because he had one of his children die, and I also felt a bit of shame because I was like, oh, he was more. I wish I had shown up better for him when he was going through his stuff, but he knew how to show up for me in not trying to fix anything, but in just being there. Like, what is more likely to make something traumatic or not is your feelings of aloneness in it. And so just having someone be there, not the temptation to fix things. It's just like, oh, that sucks. Or like, I'm totally get it. It's such a beautiful experience for your nervous system to know that someone else's body knows what all of these grief emotions are like. And so, yeah, my last little bit of advice for people who like movies is like, honestly, watch Inside Out. Um, I know it's a kids movie. I haven't seen Inside Out 2 yet. I got to do that. But like that's just a decent way that teenagers have found quite powerful of like understanding their emotions better, and it's like written with consultation of psychologists, so it's quite sound in how it describes how different emotions play, because men need to get in touch with their full emotional experience, which all humans need to do.
Well, I love animated movies, so I'm gonna have to watch that. But no, I really loved those things you're saying. That one of the first things you said really resonated was, fight things that contribute. Don't fight things that contribute with more loneliness. That I thought was really, yeah, I really like that. And then emotional literacy, I thought was really interesting because Layla Harding, who's someone else who had on this, who's a mental health professional, she talked about emotional literacy in boys versus women or girls, and she talked about how at a young age boys are just not taught how to explain how they're feeling and things like that, where girls are, which it's interesting to hear you say that as well. So now I have kind of had two people talk about it, but yeah, it's interesting. I also like how you said about the don't ask how you're doing, because I'm very guilty of that. Because for me, I'm usually the friend that people come to, and that I'm also at, because really the only grief I've ever experienced is my mother passing, which I know people like, Corey, that's a lot. But other than that, like growing up, my life was pretty easy and pretty great, except for my mother having to yell at me to study. But other than that, it was quite easy. So, but like I went to therapy, and so now when people go through things, I definitely feel it way more because I'm like, oh, I understand what that can feel like, whether it's being anxious or having something really hard happen. So I always like really want to show up for people that I care about. But yeah, I definitely ask how you're doing. So maybe I could switch that a little bit and do
Well,
something different.
if I can qualify, people that it's known that they have mental unwellness, like who are depressed or something like that, if that's known, particularly for them, don't ask how they're doing all the time, because
Got
then
it.
they might feel like a failure if they just have the same thing to report over and over. But
Got it.
people
Got it.
who you don't know at all how they're doing and they're always up here, then I would say definitely ask them, check in. Hey man, how are you really doing? So
That's a good
there's
point.
it's not one size fits all.
No, that's a good point. Well, we'll end on that. So I really appreciate you joining today. I thought it was a really interesting discussion and some things that I haven't heard before. So I'm hoping if people listening to this, they'll kind of learn from it. So hopefully we'll get this live in the next 4 to 6 weeks, and then we can publish it and see how people react to it. And if you're free again, would love to do another session with you. It's really really great to kind of have you on and get your point of view and things like that. So I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me.